In the land of Uz, there was a man named Job, whose reputation for righteousness and integrity was unparalleled. Job was a wealthy man with an abundance of flocks and herds, including 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, and 500 donkeys. In addition to his wealth, Job had a large family consisting of 7 sons and 3 daughters. He was considered the greatest man in the East, respected by all who knew him. Job's devotion to God was evident in his life. He was blameless and upright, always careful to avoid evil. His relationship with God was one of deep reverence, and he feared the Lord in everything he did. Job's righteousness extended to his family as well. Each of his children held a feast at their homes on their birthdays, and after the festivities, Job would make offerings to God on their behalf. He feared that they might have sinned in their hearts and cursed God, so he offered sacrifices, ensuring that his family remained pure before the Lord. Job's life was one of prosperity, but it was also a life of deep faithfulness to God. He feared the Lord, lived a life of integrity, and was generous toward others. One day, as the angels of God gathered to present themselves before the Lord, Satan also came among them. God, knowing Satan's nature, pointed out Job's righteousness. He asked, "Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one like him on earth, a man who is blameless and upright, who fears God and shuns evil." Satan, ever the accuser, replied with a challenge. He suggested that Job's faith was merely a result of his blessings. "Does Job fear God for nothing?" Satan scoffed. "You have put a hedge around him and his household. You have blessed the work of his hands, and his flocks and herds are spread throughout the land. But now stretch out your hand and strike everything he has, and he will surely curse you to your face." God, knowing the true nature of Job's faith, allowed Satan to test him, but with one condition: Job himself could not be harmed. Everything else, his wealth, his children, his health, was at Satan's disposal. Thus began the first test of Job's faith. Job's first trial came swiftly. One day, as he was in his home, a messenger arrived, breathless and panicked. The oxen were plowing and the donkeys were grazing nearby when the Sabaeans attacked. They stole the animals and killed the servants, and I am the only one who has escaped to tell you. Before Job could process this disaster, another messenger arrived. The fire of God fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants, and I am the only one who has escaped to tell you. Before he could speak, yet another messenger came running. The Chaldeans formed 3 raiding parties and swept down on your camels. They stole the animals and killed the servants. I am the only one who has escaped to tell you. While this was happening, a final messenger arrived with the most devastating news of all. Your sons and daughters were feasting and drinking wine at the oldest brother's house when suddenly a mighty wind struck the 4 corners of the house, and it collapsed. They are dead, and I am the only one who has escaped to tell you. In the face of such overwhelming loss, Job's reaction was profound. He rose from his place, tore his robe, and shaved his head, a traditional expression of mourning. Then, in an astonishing act of faith, Job fell to the ground in worship and said, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will depart. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised." Despite the immense grief he felt, Job did not charge God with wrongdoing. His faith remained unshaken. Satan, having failed to make Job curse God in the face of such devastating loss, returned to the heavenly courts to challenge God again. This time, Satan contended that Job's integrity was only intact because he had not suffered physically. Skin for skin, Satan argued. A man will give all he has for his own life. But now stretch out your hand and strike his flesh and bones, and he will surely curse you to your face. God granted Satan permission to afflict Job with painful sores, but he forbade him from taking Job's life. Satan left the Lord's presence, and soon Job found himself covered in painful boils, from the soles of his feet to the crown of his head. Job took a piece of broken pottery and scraped himself with it as he sat among the ashes, trying to find relief from his agony. Job's wife, witnessing his suffering, could bear it no longer. She came to him and said, "Are you still maintaining your integrity? Curse God and die." But Job, in his wisdom, rebuked her. "You are talking like a foolish woman. Shall we accept good from God and not trouble?" In all this, Job did not sin in what he said. His faith in God remained strong, even in the midst of intense personal suffering. News of Job's misfortune spread quickly, and 3 of his friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, set out to visit him. They traveled a long distance to show their support and to comfort him. When they arrived and saw Job from a distance, they could hardly recognize him. His body was covered in sores, and he sat in ashes. They were so grieved by his suffering that they wept aloud, tore their robes, and sprinkled dust on their heads. For 7 days and nights, they sat with him in silence, sharing in his pain, because they saw how great his suffering was. After the 7th day, Job broke his silence. In his despair, he cursed the day of his birth. "May the day of my birth perish, and the night that said, 'A boy is conceived.' Why did I not perish at birth and die as I came from the womb?" Job's grief was so deep that he questioned the very reason for his existence. He asked why life was given to those who suffer and why God allows people to live in misery. Job's lament was followed by a series of debates between him and his friends. Each of them tried to offer an explanation for Job's suffering. Eliphaz, the first to speak, argued that suffering is the result of sin. He claimed that Job's afflictions must be the consequence of wrongdoing. "Remember now, who that was innocent ever perished? Or where were the upright ever destroyed?" Eliphaz said, implying that Job must have sinned to deserve such punishment. Bildad, the second friend, echoed Eliphaz's sentiments. He argued that if Job were truly upright, God would have restored him by now. "If your children have sinned against him, he has given them over to the penalty of their sin," Bildad suggested, implying that Job's children had been punished for their own wrongdoings. Zophar, the third friend, was the harshest. He accused Job of being prideful and arrogant, stating that his suffering was a reflection of his own sinfulness. "You talk too much, Job. You are guilty, and God is punishing you justly," Zophar declared. Job, in turn, defended his innocence. He insisted that he had lived righteously and had not sinned to deserve such suffering. He questioned why the wicked often prosper while the righteous suffer. He longed for a mediator, someone who could represent him before God and plead his case. As the debates continued, Job's frustration grew. He cried out for justice, longing for a direct answer from God. He asked, "Why do the wicked live on, growing old and increasing in power? Why do the evildoers prosper?" Job could not understand why he, a man of integrity, was being punished, while those who were corrupt seemed to flourish. Job's yearning for justice led him to desire an encounter with God. He wished that he could stand before God and argue his case. "If only there were someone to mediate between us, someone to bring us together," Job lamented. He felt as though he had been abandoned, yet he still held on to the hope that God would vindicate him in the end. Finally, after a long period of suffering and silence, God responded to Job. But his answer was not what Job expected. God did not explain why Job was suffering. Instead, he spoke to Job out of a whirlwind, asking a series of questions that Job could not answer. "Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation?" God asked. "Tell me if you understand. Who marked off its dimensions? Surely you know. Who stretched a measuring line across it?" Through a series of questions, God pointed to his infinite wisdom and power. He asked Job about the mysteries of creation, the stars, the oceans, and the animals. God's point was clear. Job, in his limited human perspective, could not begin to understand the vastness and complexity of God's creation. How could he possibly understand the reasons behind his suffering? Job, overwhelmed by God's words, acknowledged his limitations. "I know that you can do all things. No purpose of yours can be thwarted," he confessed. "I spoke of things I did not understand, things too wonderful for me to know. Therefore I repent in dust and ashes." God was pleased with Job's humble response. However, he rebuked Job's 3 friends for their false accusations. "You have not spoken the truth about me, as my servant Job has," God declared. He instructed them to offer sacrifices, and Job was to pray for them, so that they might be forgiven. After Job prayed for his friends, God restored his fortunes. He gave Job twice as much as he had before. Job was blessed with more children, 7 sons and 3 daughters, and his new daughters were the most beautiful in the land. Job lived for another 140 years, and he saw his children and their children to the 4th generation. Thus, Job's story ended in restoration, but it was also a profound journey of faith, suffering, and divine mystery. Through his trials, Job learned that God's wisdom and understanding are beyond human comprehension, and that suffering is not always a punishment for sin. Job's unwavering faith, even in the face of unimaginable loss, became a testament to the power of trusting in God.